All right, so we're on to making our own images, which will be pretty cool. So let's try to understand what's involved in an image. And maybe the way we can do this is just to go back to Docker Hub and look at the ghost image. So click on ghost official image. And then from here, let's, you see the supported tags, respective Dockerfile links. Let's click on the latest one. All right, now this thing is pretty long, right? Although not that bad, 100 lines is really not so bad for something as complicated as Ghost. But there's really only a couple of things we need to understand because all Docker files really operate according to a similar pattern. They all start with the word from, and from is what's called the base image. So this is like the image that we're going to start off from, right? This is an existing image on the web that we then want to build on top of. So here, the existing image on the web that they are using is the node image. So let's, we'll create a new file here. Okay, so Docker images. We'll start with the from command. Then from there, they essentially say, okay, if we're going to build Ghost, we'll start with node, and then we want to provide this various setup. So everything that you would put in the terminal, you instead provide as a run command. So maybe the next thing is to install all these packages, okay? Then run another installation. So all these command line functions that you would run, you instead put as a run command, okay? So you just proceed with the word run. So it goes start with our based image, then run other things from the terminal, and then finally you always end with a command. Okay, what is this command? We saw it before, right? When you boot up the container, this is what we want to kick off. Now there's obviously other keywords than just run and from in here, but these are the only ones we need to, these are the main ones that we need to focus on, and we can talk about the other ones a little bit later. So okay, so we have start from a base image, install maybe new libraries on top of it, or run some commands in the terminal, and then finally we will do the command. How do we want to kick off? What is the command we want to use to kick off a new container? Okay, so let's see that with our own image. Okay, so now we're going to run and create, ideally, our own image. So how do we do that? Well, let's make a new file for it. Right now, by the way, this is black because I'm in iTerm. iTerm is just another kind of terminal that you can use. You can download it from the web. I tend to prefer it, so that's what I moved over to using. And I'm going to make a new directory called my flask image, because let's make an image that will build a website in Flask. So Flask is a Python library, for those of you who may not know, that allows you to create websites. It is like professional grade. So I'm just going to type in Flask Python, and then you can see this. And then let's look for quick start, which is right here. So you can see this is what it involves to create a website. It's just these things, and then we'll get something that says hello world. Now, how do I want to, how can I actually build something like this? Well, think about what we said. We said we need to start with a base image, then, perform some run on top of it, and then kick off a command. So let's start with that. We can start with, I believe there's a Python image, okay? So I'll do Docker Hub and just Google for Python. Python, the official image. So what we can do is just say, is essentially follow that recipe. Now to build an image, we need something called, we need a Docker file. It has to, notice there's no dot at the end of it. It's just Docker file. That's it. And we can see this when we went to Ghost. Notice they called it the exact same thing, Docker file. Okay. So create a new Docker file. All right. So now that we have the Docker file, the next thing is to like essentially fill in our recipe. Remember that we always are, starting with a base image. So we say like from some existing image, then build on top of it, and then end with a command that we want to be the default for kicking off our container. So for the base image, you really just have to think about like how would you create or perform the task that you're trying to do without Docker. So for example, right now we're trying to build a website, Flask. And what we need to do is, I think, start with Python and then install Flask. And then from there, if you look at the quick start, you can see we just have to essentially copy this code and then run some command and boot it up. So what I like to do is actually perform these steps outside of the Docker environment, outside of my Docker file, and then copy them over to Docker, especially when I'm getting started. So right now, I already have Python on my computer, so that seems like that's a good step. The next thing I would need to do is actually probably pip3 install Flask. And it looks like I already have that downloaded, but that's probably what I have to do next in the Docker file. And then once that's downloaded, the next thing for me to do is essentially follow along with this Flask application. Now I already know a little something about Flask, so I'll modify this slightly, but that's what you could do if it's just follow along with the quick start. So I'll go to touch index.py, and then I'll go back here, and I'll essentially copy and paste the code that we saw in the quick start. So what this is saying is when a user goes to like a root URL, display hello world. And if I want to have the application start running and listening, well, I could just follow their directions, Flask run. I like it a little bit better if instead I do app.run. So this is my website application, and now I'm running it. And I'm going through this quickly because I'm not trying to teach about Flask right now. We're trying to go through Docker. So, okay, in order to run my website, I can now do Python 3 index.py. You see that? Now this is running. If I click on this, it's running on port 5000. There's my website. All right. So now that I've got this working locally, the next task is to translate this into essentially the steps that we just performed, but in my Docker file. So we'll start from our base image in my Docker file. In this case, that'll be Python. And I'm doing this quickly, but essentially you just search around on Docker Hub to find a good starting point, a starting point that you can rely on that gets you as close as possible, so you don't have to do too much work. So we'll start with the Python image, and then think about the next step that we did. Well, the next step was to run pip install Flask. So that's what we can do next, right? It's just do pip3 install Flask. But to actually perform this in Docker, you have to put the run command. And then think about what we did next. Well, the next thing we did, we actually created this file. We'll talk about that in a little bit, was we did Python 3 index.py, right, to run that file. Okay, so we will run into a problem with this, but let's try it anyway. So do command Python 3, index.py. So notice how I did this. Each of the words here, Python 3 index.py, I put them in a list, okay, in a list of strings. And these are double quoted strings. We'll probably all make the mistake once in our lives, if we're lucky only once, where we use single quoted strings instead. And then we will run into a weird error, and it won't work until you just remember you have to use double quoted strings. All right, so we'll do from Python 3, then install Flask, basically add another layer on top, and then this is the last thing, the command that we'll run to kick off the process of my new container. So let's try to, run this image, or say, actually what we need to do first is save the image. Because if you look at docker image ls, you'll see we don't have that, like any image saved. So instead what we can do is do docker build dot. And dot stands for the current directory. And so what will happen is Docker will look for a file called a DockerFile. And if it finds one, it will use the instructions in the Docker file to start with the base image, meaning it might download it if it doesn't exist, and then run this, and then when the image boots up into a container, it will then try to run this command. So let's do docker build dot, and you can see here it goes. So it is loading from the definition from the Docker file. It is, at this point, you see this, load metadata for Docker library Python latest. That's our base image. It's taking a little while now, probably because it's downloading it, right? And I guess it has to extract something from the image. So okay, now we're on to the next step. It's now installing Flask and exporting the layers, exporting to image, writing to image. So if I do docker image ls now, this thing is my new image. Now there's no name for it, which is not ideal. So instead what we can do is docker build -t, the name. So we'll call this flask image, then have the dot. So we're adding another flag where we're saying we want to tag the image, give it a name as flask image. Let's do this again. And then we'll do docker image ls. And now this image actually has a name. All right, pretty nice. Now the image was built successfully, but one issue we'll probably run into, well, let's just see. I'm gonna do docker run, the name of the image, flask image, and I'm just guessing this is gonna break. Okay, it's pretty perfect. Cannot open file index.py, which makes perfect sense. We have an index.py on my local computer, but we do not have an index.py on inside the actual image, right? We didn't put it there. We started with Python 3, we ran pip3 install flask, but there's nothing inside here. But still, this is pretty good starting point, because what it tells me is that at least, like, where did this error message come from? It came from the fact that we were trying to run this command. So at least we got here and we got to that error message. So that's pretty cool. The other thing we could do is we could do docker image. Maybe we want to confirm that we successfully installed Flask. So what we could do is docker image, Flask image, and then we can connect, let's say bash, and then we want to connect to this. And let's connect to my image, and we'll override the default of running this to then just run the bash command. Docker run, -it, flask image, and bash. And now I'm inside my image that I just created. And now let's just do pip3 list. And there's my Flask library. So it looks like I did successfully install Flask, which is pretty cool. So in other words, I started with Python, that worked. I then installed Flask, that worked. I have to now somehow get an index.py file inside my Docker image. So we'll talk about that next.